I booked the room because it was half the normal price in winter, and I was broke. February in coastal Maine did not attract tourists. I told myself the discount was seasonal and practical. I needed a place for 3 weeks while finishing contract work for a marine supply company in a nearby town. Hotels were too expensive. The listing showed a simple bedroom, a shared bathroom, and a kitchen I could use during the day. The photos looked honest. Plain walls, narrow bed, a window facing the water. The description mentioned quiet, solitude, and winter rates. I clicked reserve without much thought. The house sat at the end of a narrow road that curved along the shoreline. No streetlights, just snow packed hard by wind and tires. The ocean pressed close to the back of the property. The yard ended in rock and ice. When I arrived, the tide was low, and the smell of salt and kelp drifted up from the dark water. The house itself was older, weathered gray wood, 2 stories, with a steep roof and a small porch that sagged slightly in the middle. No decorations, no lights except one dim bulb by the door. The owner opened the door almost immediately after I knocked. He was tall and thin, wearing a sweater that looked worn soft from years of use. His hair was gray but not fully white. His face had deep lines that suggested wind and long hours outdoors. He nodded once and stepped aside to let me in. No handshake, no smile. Not rude, just restrained, like someone conserving energy. Inside, the house was warm but smelled faintly of damp wood and something sharp underneath. Maybe cleaning supplies, maybe fish. I did not question it. Coastal houses often smelled like that. The floors creaked with each step. The walls held old photographs of boats, docks, and men standing stiffly beside massive catches. No women, no children, all black and white. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hall. The bed was made neatly. The sheets smelled clean. A small desk sat under the window, and from there I could see the water stretching out into darkness. Waves rolled in steadily, breaking against rock. The sound filled the room. It felt constant, like breathing. The owner explained the basic rules through a printed page left on the desk. Quiet hours. Lock the door. Kitchen use before 10 at night. No guests. He did not speak these rules. He had already gone downstairs by the time I finished reading. The first night passed without trouble. I slept deeply, worn out from travel. I woke once to use the bathroom and noticed the house was silent except for the ocean. The sound was loud enough to feel through the walls. Over the next few days, a routine formed. I woke early, made coffee, and worked on my laptop at the desk. The owner stayed out of sight during the day. Sometimes I heard him moving downstairs, slow steps, careful movements. He never lingered in shared spaces when I was there. He washed dishes immediately after use. He kept everything orderly. Each night around midnight, I heard the back door open and close. Heavy boots. A pause. Then silence. I assumed he went out for walks or checked something by the shore. Fishermen kept strange hours. I fell asleep easily to the waves. After a week, I noticed something small but persistent. Between 1 in the morning and about 15 minutes later, the sound of the ocean stopped. Not faded, not distant, gone. No waves, no wind, no creak of the house. Absolute silence. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Sleep can play tricks. I checked the time once and saw it was 1:07. The silence pressed against my ears. I lay still, listening for any movement. Then, just as suddenly, the waves returned. Normal, relentless. It happened again the next night, and the next. Always the same window of time. Always complete silence. I tried to explain it to myself. Tide shifts. Wind changes. Maybe ice moving offshore. Still, the pattern felt precise. During the day, the house never felt threatening. Cold light filled the rooms. The owner kept to himself. He left groceries on the counter sometimes without comment. I returned the favor by cleaning thoroughly. We existed in parallel without overlap. On my second week, the smell changed. Some mornings, when I woke, the air held a heavier scent. Fish and something metallic. It lingered faintly in the hall, but not in my room. By afternoon, it faded. I noticed the owner spent more time outside during those days. His boots left damp marks by the back door that dried into dark stains. I started locking my door at night. Not out of fear exactly. More out of habit. The silence between 1 and 1:15 became harder to ignore. I stayed awake once to test it. I watched the minute hand move. At exactly 1, the sound cut off. No gradual shift. One moment waves, the next nothing. My chest tightened, not from panic, but from the wrongness of it. When the sound returned, I slept poorly. On my last night, a storm moved in. Snow blew sideways, and the wind rattled the windows. The ocean sounded violent, crashing hard against the rocks. I fell asleep expecting the usual silence, thinking the storm might disrupt it. I woke abruptly, heart racing. The room smelled wrong. Strong fish odor mixed with copper. Like blood. The air felt damp, heavy. I realized the door was open. I never slept with it open. I sat up slowly. The hallway was dark. No sound from the ocean. I checked the time. 1:09 a.m. The floor near my bed was wet. Not spilled water. It had a thicker look. I stood carefully and followed the trail into the hall. Wet footprints marked the wood floor. Bare feet. Large. They led toward the stairs, then disappeared at the back door. I did not move for a long time. I listened. No wind. No waves. No movement in the house. Eventually, the ocean returned, loud and aggressive, as if nothing had happened. I locked myself in the room and stayed awake until morning. When daylight came, I packed everything quickly. My hands shook, but my thinking stayed clear. I left the room clean. No damage. No mess. The footprints were gone. The floor was dry. The smell lingered faintly near the back of the house. The owner was waiting by the door when I came downstairs. He handed me an envelope without looking at me. Inside was a full refund for my remaining nights and the past week. No note. No explanation. I left without a word. I drove straight to a motel inland and finished my work there. Months later, curiosity pushed me to look up local records. I found old news articles buried in archives. Winter fishing accidents. Unreported catches. A man questioned once about dumping waste illegally at night. No charges. No follow-up. I never proved anything. I did not need to. The silence, the timing, the smell, the footprints. The refund. I should not have needed the discount to understand why that room stayed empty in winter. We booked the lake house because the pictures made winter look clean and quiet. Snow wrapped the roof evenly. The lake behind it looked smooth and pale, like a single sheet of glass. There was a fireplace, a wide window facing the water, and a narrow dock buried under snow. We wanted something slow and contained. January 2020 still felt uncomplicated. We were tired from work, tired from noise, and wanted a few days where nothing asked anything of us. The drive took us north through flat land, and then into heavier trees. Towns thinned out. Cell service dropped in and out. The last stretch followed a plowed road that hugged the edge of the lake. We passed only one other house, set far back and dark. Snowbanks rose high along the shoulders. The lake stayed visible through gaps in the trees. It was fully frozen, white in the middle and darker near the edges, where the ice showed through. The host had sent a message before we arrived. It mentioned that people in the area avoided the lake during winter because of old accidents. It was framed as a warning to stay off the ice. At the time, it sounded like local caution passed down without much thought. Every lake town has stories like that. The house itself was smaller than the photos suggested. One level, with siding, low roofline. The crawlspace vents were visible along the foundation, half buried by snow. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and cold air that had been sealed in. The heat worked well. The fireplace drew clean. The windows were spotless, including the big one facing the lake. That window became the center of everything. The lake filled it completely, an uninterrupted plain that made the house feel like it floated. The first night was calm. The temperature stayed well below zero. The lake made noise. Long cracks traveled under the ice with deep hollow sounds that started far away and ended beneath the house. I had heard ice shift before, but this was constant. Sharp reports followed by drawn-out groans. The sound traveled easily across the frozen surface. It felt close even when it could not be. I told myself it was normal. Thick ice contracts. Pressure moves. Still, it made sleep shallow. Each crack felt like something breaking directly under the floor. The second day stayed clear and bright. The sun never rose high. Shadows stretched long across the lake by early afternoon. We walked the shoreline, but did not step onto the ice. It looked solid but wrong, like a surface that did not want weight. There were no footprints anywhere, no tracks, no signs of recent use. No ice fishing shacks. No holes drilled. The lake looked abandoned. That evening, the cracking grew louder. The sound did not follow a pattern. Sometimes it came in clusters. Sometimes a single crack snapped the air, and then nothing followed. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the light fade. The lake shifted from white to blue to gray. When the last light dropped, the ice reflected the moon faintly, enough to show the surface stretching far out. That was when I saw the shape. It stood well out from shore, closer to the center than to us. It was darker than the ice and vertical, too tall to be a person standing on ice without gear. It did not move. It did not sway. It looked narrow from that distance, almost like a post, but there were no posts on the lake. There were no tracks leading to it. The ice around it was smooth. I watched it for a long time, waiting for movement that would explain it. The cracks continued. Each sound felt like it should reach the shape and knock it down. It stayed fixed. I checked again later from a different angle inside the room. The shape remained. The scale bothered me most. It was taller than it should have been, even accounting for distance. I did not go outside. I did not want to break the surface with sound or light. We went to bed late. Sleep did not come easily. Sometime before morning, the cracking stopped. The silence felt heavier than the noise. I woke before dawn and went to the window. The shape was gone. The lake looked empty again. No mark showed where it had stood. In daylight, the surface looked unchanged. No holes. No dark patches. Nothing suggested anyone or anything had been out there. We packed slowly that morning, planning to leave early the next day instead of staying the full booking. The house felt different. The warmth felt forced, like something fighting the cold rather than holding it back. While loading the car, I noticed marks near the shoreline. The snow there looked disturbed. Long, shallow impressions led from the edge of the ice toward the house. They were not footprints. They looked like something heavy had been dragged or had crawled. The snow was darker in those grooves. Wet. The marks ended near the foundation, at the far side of the house where the crawlspace vent sat lower to the ground. The vent cover was bent slightly outward. The snow beneath it had melted and refrozen unevenly. Water had dripped there recently. I checked the lake edge again. The ice near shore looked rougher, as if broken and refrozen. That area had a thin layer of slush frozen over. The wet marks made sense only if something had come out of the water. We contacted the host to ask about the crawl space. The response came back quickly and made it clear that we should not look under the house. The message said there was nothing there and that it was unsafe to disturb the area in winter. It also said the lake caused strange effects that looked worse than they were. That answer did not match what I could see with my own eyes. The marks were fresh. The temperature had stayed far below freezing. Water should not have been present unless it had come from beneath the ice or from inside the house. I did look briefly under the house, from a distance, without crawling in. The crawl space was shallow. Snow had been pushed aside there recently. I could see a dark hollow beyond the vent. Something had been there long enough to melt snow and leave pooled water that had started to freeze again. There were bits of plant matter and dirt that did not belong under a sealed house in winter. We left that morning. The drive back felt longer. Neither of us spoke much. The image of the shape on the lake stayed with me. I kept trying to make it fit into something ordinary. The explanation came weeks later, after I looked into the area on my own. The lake had a history that went beyond thin ice warnings. Decades earlier, a worker had drowned when a temporary ice marker tipped and trapped him beneath the surface. Those markers had been tall metal frames used to mark weak areas during construction seasons. Most had been removed, but one had sunk and frozen upright years later before being pulled out again. Photos showed it standing alone on the ice, tall and narrow, exactly like what I had seen. As for the crawl space, reports mentioned a man who had survived winters by sheltering near lake houses, using residual heat and water access through the ice. He had drowned during a thaw years earlier. Before that, he had been known to move along shorelines at night, dragging gear and himself when his legs failed him. Wet trails had been reported more than once. After his death, similar marks still appeared during extreme cold snaps when pressure forced water up through cracks near shore. The lake did not produce anything impossible. It produced conditions that let ordinary things look wrong. Pressure cracks pushed water out where it should not be. Old structures resurfaced briefly before sinking again. Heat from houses melted snow where it should not melt. The host avoided questions because acknowledging those details would drive people away. Nothing followed us home. No mystery remained unresolved. The explanation fit every detail. That did not make the memory easier to sit with. The image of something standing alone on the ice stays sharp because it was real. It was a place where accidents layered over time and left marks that winter did not erase. I booked the cabin because I wanted distance. Not a dramatic reset or a life change, just a pause. 3 nights alone between long hikes, no service, no schedule. The listing promised quiet and order. It showed photos of a small wood cabin surrounded by trees, nothing nearby, no visible road. It looked maintained in a way that suggested care rather than style. That appealed to me. I arrived in the afternoon. My car was the only one in the small gravel pullout. The cabin sat a short walk from it, far enough that the engine sound faded before I reached the door. The key was in a lockbox. The code worked on the first try. The door opened easily, no sticking, no sound. Inside, everything felt arranged with intention. The floor was swept. The counters were clear. The furniture was sparse but placed carefully. The bed was made tight, hospital corners, no wrinkles. The air smelled neutral, not like cleaner, not like wood smoke. No personal items were visible. No photos, no decorations. Just a table, a chair, the bed, a small kitchenette, and a single bookshelf fixed to the wall. I noticed the lack of dust first. Corners, shelves, even the tops of the door frames were clean. I am not someone who checks for that, but the absence stood out. It felt less like a rental, and more like a room that reset itself between occupants. The bookshelf held only a few items. A laminated trail map, a binder with cabin rules printed in large font, a flashlight, a guest book. The book was plain, black cover, no label. It looked older than the rest of the room. The edges were worn. I assumed it would be full of messages about sunsets and gratitude. I sat at the table and opened it without thinking. The first pages were dated years back. The handwriting changed from entry to entry, but the content did not follow the usual pattern. No one thanked the host. No one mentioned comfort or beauty. Each entry read like notes meant for reference. Times were recorded. Sleep start. Sleep end. Notes on rest quality. Mentions of waking due to sound. Descriptions of movement outside. Wind direction. Animal noise frequency. Light conditions inside the cabin. Whether the door was locked. Whether windows were covered. Some entries included sketches. Crude outlines of the cabin with marks around the perimeter. Lines showing paths through the trees. Arrows pointing to windows. The tone was detached. No emotion. No context. No names. Just dates and observations. I told myself it was a themed guest book. Some attempt at making visitors feel part of a shared experience. A strange choice, but not dangerous. I flipped forward. The entries became more detailed. Measurements appeared. Step counts from the door to the tree line. Notes on how long headlights remained visible from inside after arrival. Comments on car models parked in the pullout. One entry described a blue sedan with a dent on the rear door. I drive a blue sedan. The dent is small but noticeable. I checked the date. It was from the previous year. I assumed coincidence. Another entry mentioned a solo hiker arriving late afternoon, unloading one pack, wearing a dark shirt. That matched many people. I reached the final pages. The handwriting there was consistent across several entries. The pen pressure was even. The spacing precise. The notes shifted from general to specific. One entry described a vehicle arriving at 3:14 p.m. Gravel noise lasted 12 seconds. Engine idled briefly before shutting off. Driver exited, paused, scanned tree line. Wore a light gray shirt. Car backed into space rather than pulling forward. That was exactly how I parked. I backed in because the pullout was narrow. I checked my shirt. Light gray. The date was today. I read it again, slower. The time was accurate. I had checked my watch when I arrived. I was alone when I walked to the cabin. I had not seen anyone. I had not passed another car. The entry continued with notes about how long I stayed outside before unlocking the door. How many times I looked at my phone. Which hand I used to carry my pack. Those details were correct. My first reaction was confusion, then a tight sense of exposure. I stood and looked around the room. Nothing had changed. The windows faced trees. The light was still steady. No sound but insects and distant wind. I went back to the book. The last entry was dated 2 weeks earlier. It ended mid-sentence. The handwriting cut off sharply. The pen mark dragged slightly, as if interrupted. I closed the book and put it back on the shelf. I told myself the host kept notes and copied them into the guest book for some reason. That explanation did not sit well, but I did not have a better one. I went hiking to clear my head. The trails were empty. The woods were dense enough that sound carried poorly. I walked longer than planned, staying out until evening. When I returned, the light was fading. The cabin looked unchanged. The door was still locked. I checked the ground around it before entering. The soil was packed hard. Pine needles covered most of it. I did not see clear footprints. Inside, everything was still clean. No signs of entry. I locked the door and closed the curtains. I ate quickly and lay down early. Sleep did not come easily. I kept thinking about the book, the accuracy of the notes, the timing, the fact that the entry existed before I touched anything inside. Sometime after dark, I heard movement outside. Not branches scraping or animals passing through. It was measured, heavy steps that slowed near the walls. They circled the cabin at a steady pace. The sound paused at each window. Not tapping, just stopping, lingering, then moving on. The pattern repeated. One full loop, then another. I lay still. The bed frame did not creak when I shifted slightly. I did not check the windows. I kept my eyes on the ceiling. The flashlight on the shelf stayed where it was. I did not reach for it. The steps continued for hours. The pace did not change. No coughing, no speech, no attempt to enter. Just presence. At some point near morning, the movement stopped. Silence returned in a way that felt intentional. I did not sleep. I watched the light change through the curtain until dawn. As soon as it was bright enough to see, I dressed and packed. I did not eat. I did not clean. I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The ground showed signs of compression near the windows. Not clear footprints, but flattened needles and disturbed soil where someone had stood for long periods. The marks were deliberate and evenly spaced. I walked to my car and left. I did not send a message through the platform. I did not report anything. I wanted distance more than answers. Weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I searched public records for the property, using the general area and photos from the listing. The cabin belonged to a private individual who lived nearby on a larger parcel of land. He had previous complaints filed against him years earlier. Nothing criminal. Just reports of boundary violations, unwanted surveillance, strange documentation habits. The guest book made sense then. It was not a shared journal. It was a record. The cabin was not a rental in the usual sense. It was a controlled environment. The visitors were subjects. The host never followed up because there was nothing to ask. My data had already been collected. The book did not end mid-sentence because of mystery. It ended because the person writing it stopped caring to finish. I did not go back for the rest of my trip. I did not hike again that week. I learned that isolation means little if someone else is paying closer attention than you are. I booked the room in a shared apartment for a work conference. The city was cold, gray, and humid in December, and I had landed late in the evening, exhausted from flights and delays. The apartment was on the 4th floor of an older building, its hallway dimly lit with flickering fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of mildew and cooking oil. The door to the unit opened without resistance, and the interior felt small but tidy, a mix of second-hand furniture and modern appliances. I had barely placed my bag on the floor when I noticed the host's laptop on the kitchen table, screen open, cursor blinking. It was logged into a security camera feed. The camera names were in a list on the side, each labeled with a first name, and when I glanced at the feed, every angle pointed toward the bedroom I had just entered. I froze. It felt impossible. I had been careful to choose a room that seemed standard, professional, a place to sleep and work between conference sessions. I hadn't expected this. My first instinct was to leave immediately, but the hallway was empty, the stairwell poorly lit, and the air outside smelled like exhaust and wet concrete. I stayed in the apartment, hoping it was just a fluke, maybe leftover footage from a previous tenant or an unattended security system. I moved around the small living area cautiously, noticing the way the camera angles covered every corner of the bedroom. There were at least 4 cameras focused on the room itself, one trained on the door, one on the bed, one on the window, one on the small workspace. The timestamps on the screen showed days and weeks of recordings, neatly labeled with the names of prior guests. Some of the clips were hours long, others only minutes. The host had left them organized by name, date, and duration. The realization sank in slowly. Someone had been watching every guest. I tried to ignore it and unpacked my things mechanically. My suitcase leaned against the wall, clothes folded and stacked, my laptop resting on the desk in the bedroom. The apartment itself seemed ordinary enough otherwise. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and bread, dishes stacked in the sink, a small stack of mail on the counter. There was no sign of the host, and the absence gave the place a hollow feeling, a silence that pressed against my ears. I spent the next hour convincing myself to stay. I had no alternative, the city was expensive, and my work schedule demanded I remain close to the conference center. I locked the bedroom door, double-checked that the blinds were drawn, and sat on the edge of the bed. The laptop screen glowed faintly across the room, still logged into the feed. I avoided looking at it for a while, but eventually curiosity forced me back. The feed had shifted slightly, a new clip playing automatically, showing someone else's bedroom from weeks prior. I recognized the scene as one of the names from the list. Their movements, private and unaware, were laid out frame by frame. I kept glancing at the clock, trying to imagine the hours passing until morning. My phone vibrated against the bedspread. I picked it up slowly. The screen showed a new message. The sender's name matched the host. The words were short, almost clinical. "You forgot to close the blinds." I froze again. My stomach turned, and the air felt heavier. There was no mistaking it. Someone had been watching me in real time. I did not respond. My hands shook slightly as I set the phone down. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the distant traffic, was amplified, unnatural. I wanted to leave immediately, but the idea of navigating the dark building, stairs, and streets in the middle of the night without anyone noticing made me hesitate. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening, trying to force myself to sleep, but every instinct was alert, tense. I could feel the presence of the cameras as if they were physical objects in the room, pointing at me from angles I could not escape. I wondered if they were recording now, if they could see me typing this note, if the host had already reviewed my arrival. My breathing was shallow, my eyes darting to the laptop screen every few minutes. The cursor on the feed blinked, waiting. Time passed slowly, every minute drawn out. My phone buzzed again, another message, something brief about the kitchen. I ignored it. I felt trapped, aware of my own vulnerability in the room. I considered smashing the laptop or tearing the cords out, but the thought of confronting a host I had never met in an apartment in an unfamiliar city terrified me more. I needed to leave safely, quietly, without alerting whoever might be watching. I packed my bag in the darkness, trying not to make noise. Every movement seemed exaggerated, echoing off the walls. I pulled the suitcase to the door, checked the lock one last time, and left the apartment as carefully as I could, pressing myself against the walls in the narrow hallway. The stairwell smelled of damp plaster, my shoes scuffed on the concrete. I descended slowly, counting steps to avoid tripping, listening for any sound behind me. Outside, the street was empty, gray and cold. I walked quickly to a corner where I could call a rideshare without being noticed, keeping my head down. My hands trembled as I held the phone, ordering a car that would take me to a hotel I had researched earlier in the day, a place expensive enough to feel safe. I stayed alert for shadows, for anyone following, until I reached the hotel, checked in, and locked myself in the room. I reported the incident immediately. I described the apartment, the open laptop, the camera feeds, and the messages. Within hours, the Airbnb listing had disappeared. I later learned it had been removed permanently, and the host's account was deactivated. I never returned to that city for another work trip without booking a professional hotel. The image of that laptop, glowing on the kitchen table, with names and footage lined up neatly, stayed with me. The idea that someone had logged in, had been watching without pause, waiting for me to arrive, was impossible to forget. Even months later, I catch myself double-checking locks, blinds, my phone, making sure nothing is left exposed. The memory is precise, the glow of the screen, the names scrolling by, the quiet, clinical tone of the message. It feels like an invisible weight, a reminder that privacy can vanish in a moment. I never stayed in an Airbnb alone again. I learned to choose safety over cost, public over private. I learned to notice the small details, the placement of a laptop, the angle of a camera, the presence of someone even when the apartment appears empty. That night was a slow, quiet horror, without violence or confrontation, but it was complete, undeniable, and entirely real. I left before sunrise, and in leaving, I finally reclaimed my control, but the memory remains, clear and vivid, a warning I carry with me. I never saw the host again, never received a follow-up, and never understood their motives. The listing vanished as quickly as I fled, and the city returned to its ordinary rhythm. But I know now what it means to be watched without consent, and how quickly a space can transform from temporary refuge to a trap. The lesson is simple: always notice what is left open, always question what appears normal, and never ignore the quiet signs that something is deeply wrong. The apartment no longer exists, but its presence lingers in my mind, precise, unnerving, and permanent. We went in March of 2021, the first real weekend any of us had traveled since the lockdowns eased. We were all restless and out of practice at being around people. The desert felt like neutral ground, empty, safe, for college friends, all recently vaccinated, all convinced we were being careful. We wanted quiet, sun, and the novelty of sleeping somewhere that was not our own apartments. The house sat far from the paved road. The last stretch was packed dirt, pale and powdery, winding through low scrub and scattered boulders. The concrete structure came into view slowly, low and flat, almost the same color as the surrounding sand. It looked more like a utility building than a place meant to be lived in. No fence, no trees tall enough to cast shade, just a squat rectangle with narrow windows and a single metal door. The listing photos had been wide angle and flattering. Inside, the space was smaller than expected but clean. Polished concrete floors, minimal furniture, a long counter with a few mismatched stools. The bedrooms were pushed to the corners, each with a window facing a different direction. My room looked east toward a shallow wash that cut through the land. The hot tub sat behind the house, sunk into a concrete pad. No cover, just open water already warming in the afternoon sun. That had been the main reason we booked it. The price was low, and the host had responded quickly when we asked about noise, neighbors, and animals. The message about wildlife stood out. He stressed there was no danger, no coyotes, no trespassing issues, no need to worry. At the time, it felt like good customer service. The first evening passed without incident. We cooked simple food, drank a little, watched the sky turn orange and then purple. The desert cooled fast. The silence was deeper than I expected. No traffic, no distant music. Even the wind faded after sunset. When the lights inside were on, the windows reflected us back at ourselves. We used the hot tub before bed. The water smelled faintly metallic but clean. The stars were sharp and numerous. I remember thinking how exposed we were, for bodies in warm water surrounded by miles of open land. It still felt calm. We went to sleep early. The beds were firm. The sheets smelled like detergent. Sometime before dawn, I woke to the sound of nothing at all. That sudden awareness that something had interrupted sleep without making a noise. I lay still listening. The house held its temperature. No pipes. No hum. I fell back asleep. The footprints were discovered after sunrise. One of us stepped outside with a cup of coffee and froze. They circled the house in a wide loop, pressed deep into the dirt. Bare feet, long toes. The impressions were clear enough to see the arch and heel. Too large to be any of us. The stride was uneven, like the person had been moving slowly, deliberately. They never came close to the doors. They stayed several feet away, tracking the perimeter. In some places, the prints overlapped, as if the person had walked the same path more than once. No drag marks, no signs of running, just a quiet loop around the building. We checked our own feet, compared sizes. None matched. We looked for tire tracks or another set of prints that might explain it. There were none. The dirt beyond the circle was untouched. The desert has a way of making rational explanations feel thin. We told ourselves someone had wandered through. A hiker, a neighbor we could not see, maybe someone curious about the house. It was public land in many directions. The sun rose higher, and the prints softened at the edges. The heat made everything less sharp. We decided not to mention it to the host yet. It felt dramatic. We had only one night left. Leaving early would mean giving up the hot tub, and the sense that we could still do things like this. That afternoon, we drove into town, bought groceries, filled the gas tank, took photos in the park. Everything felt normal. When we returned near sunset, the house looked unchanged. No new tracks. No signs of anyone else. The second night felt different. The air was still. The temperature dropped fast. We used the hot tub again, though not for long. The darkness felt closer. The motion lights on the corners of the house turned on twice while we were inside. There was no wind. Nothing moved in the distance. I went to bed earlier than the others. My room faced the wash, a shallow cut in the land with scattered rocks and dry brush. The window had no curtain, just a simple blind that I left half open. Moonlight filled the space, pale and even. At around 2:30 in the morning, I felt pressure against the wall near the head of the bed. Not a sound, not a scrape. A shift, like someone leaning their weight there and then adjusting. The concrete transmitted it clearly. My body reacted before my mind did. My breath stopped. My hands went cold. I waited. The pressure remained for several seconds, then eased. There were no footsteps afterward, no retreat, just the absence of that presence. I did not move until the light in the room began to change with the coming dawn. I told the others in the morning. We checked the outside wall. No marks, no damage. The dirt near that side of the house was smoothed over by wind overnight. The hot tub was empty, completely drained. No puddle, no wet concrete. The surface inside was dry, dust already settling at the bottom. We inspected the plumbing. The drain was closed. No visible cracks, no leaks beneath. The water had not soaked into the ground. It had been released, and then the area cleaned by heat and time. We packed without rushing, but without lingering. No one suggested staying longer. The desert felt watchful in daylight now. The silence no longer felt neutral. Before leaving, I opened the Airbnb app to message the host. The listing would not load. I searched for it manually. Nothing came up. The host profile was gone. No reviews. No message history. The booking still showed in my trips, but the details were stripped down to an address and dates. On the drive back, we stayed quiet. The dirt road felt longer than it had on arrival. When we reached pavement, I checked the rearview mirror more than once, expecting to see something following. There was nothing. Later, at home, I looked up property records. The house was owned by a holding company based out of state. No short-term rental permits were listed for that address. The reviews we remembered were gone, likely taken down with the account. The host name did not appear anywhere else online. The explanation that settled in my mind over time was not complicated. Someone knew that house was rented on weekends. Someone knew the layout, the lights, the habits of short-term guests. The footprints were a test. The motion lights were a signal. The drained hot tub was proof of access. The house was not isolated by accident. It was isolated because it made things easier. Easier to watch. Easier to approach without being seen. Easier to leave no record behind. We were lucky. For people. 2 nights. We left intact. Nothing was taken. Nothing escalated. The host account vanished because it was disposable. The house remained, waiting for the next group willing to trust a cheap listing in the desert. I no longer assume that isolation equals safety. In places like that, it often means the opposite. I booked the place because I wanted something quiet that did not require effort. The listing showed a small farmhouse at the edge of rolling fields, hedgerows thick with late summer growth, and a promise of fresh eggs left at the door each morning. The description leaned hard on words like peaceful and authentic. That was enough for me. I was newly divorced and tired in a way that felt physical. I wanted isolation without risk, somewhere rural but ordinary. Southern England felt safe. August felt forgiving. The drive out took longer than expected. Narrow roads pinched between hedges scraped the sides of my car. The countryside looked calm in a postcard way, but there was an emptiness to it. No walkers, no tractors, no dogs barking from yards. When I finally reached the property, the farmhouse sat low against the land, stone walls dulled by age, roof tiles uneven. A cluster of outbuildings leaned behind it. Beyond that, fields ran out toward a line of trees that looked darker than the rest of the landscape, dense and uncut. The air smelled of damp earth and manure. Flies hung low. Chickens moved in tight groups near the coop, heads jerking with quick, nervous movements. They stayed close to the building, never crossing the invisible line where the grass grew taller. I noticed that right away because animals usually spread out when they feel safe. These did not. Inside, the place was clean but spare. No clutter. No personal items beyond what was needed to suggest someone lived there. The bed was narrow. The windows were small and thick. Every door had a solid latch. It felt more functional than welcoming. I told myself that was just how farm places were. The first evening passed quietly. I cooked simple food, ate at the small table, listened to the distant sounds of insects and wind moving through hedges. As the light dropped, I noticed activity outside. The livestock were being moved into the barn earlier than I expected. The sky still held color. It was not even close to dark. The chickens resisted being herded, flapping and crowding the door, making sharp sounds. When the barn doors closed, the land went still. I slept lightly that night. The bed creaked with every movement. The walls carried sound in a way that made distance hard to judge. Something moved outside at least once, slow and heavy enough to register through the floor. I assumed it was livestock settling or a badger passing through. In the morning, there were eggs left as promised. Still warm. I cooked them and ate them standing by the window, watching the yard. The chickens were let out later than I expected. When they emerged, they stayed close together again. They pecked near the barn and the house, never drifting toward the trees. Every so often, one would lift its head and freeze, body rigid, as if listening for something I could not hear. The second day was warm. I walked the edge of the fields, keeping close to the hedges. The ground near the treeline was churned in places. Not fresh, but disturbed enough to catch my attention. The soil was pressed down in wide arcs, flattened grass bent away from the woods. It looked like paths that did not follow any human pattern. I did not cross into the trees. The air changed near them. Cooler. Stale. That evening, the animals were locked away even earlier. The sun was still high. I felt a brief sense of relief when the barn doors shut, like something had been secured properly. That reaction surprised me. I had not noticed feeling uneasy until that moment. Night came with no warning. Clouds rolled in, swallowing the last of the light. The fields disappeared into black. I sat inside with the windows closed. The house held warmth but not comfort. Around midnight, a sound tore through the quiet. It came from the field, sharp and high, then dropped into something rough and strained. It did not repeat in a pattern. It lasted long enough for my body to lock up. It was not like any animal sound I knew. Not a fox. Not livestock. It had a raw edge that felt forced, like lungs pushed past their limit. I did not look outside. I stood in the middle of the room, heart pounding, waiting for it to stop. When it did, the silence felt wrong. Too complete. I stayed awake until morning. At first light, I went outside. The grass was wet. The air smelled metallic. One chicken was missing. The rest clustered tighter than before, making low sounds, refusing to spread out. I searched the yard. There were no feathers, no blood, no signs of a struggle, just an absence where one bird should have been. I checked the perimeter of the barn. A new lock had been added to the door. It was heavier than the others, bright metal against old wood. The barn itself looked reinforced in small ways I had not noticed before. Extra boards along the lower edges. Wire mesh behind slats that looked decorative at a glance. The place was built to keep things in or keep things out, possibly both. The next 2 nights followed the same pattern. Early lockup, long hours of quiet, sounds in the distance that never resolved into something clear. I stopped walking near the trees. I stopped opening the windows at night. Sleep came in short bursts. I felt watched without ever seeing anything. On the final morning, I noticed tracks in the soft earth near the barn. They were wide and deep, uneven, not paw prints, not hooves. The ground showed drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled backward. They led toward the treeline and vanished into hard soil. I packed that afternoon. I did not rush, but I did not linger. Before I left, I did what I should have done earlier. I searched local records online using my phone. Planning applications, agricultural complaints. There were mentions of livestock losses on nearby properties going back years. No clear cause. No pattern that could be pinned down easily. Farmers blamed escaped animals, feral dogs, human interference. Nothing was proven. One report mentioned a man detained for trespassing after being found sleeping in a barn on a neighboring property. Another noted that he had a history of living rough and moving between rural areas. The name matched the host. The picture that formed was not dramatic. It was worse than that. A man living alone, controlling a small patch of land, protecting his animals from something that wandered. Something human. Someone who moved through fields at night, took what could be carried, knew how to leave little trace. Someone who knew the land well enough to avoid roads and lights. Someone who screamed, either to scare animals or because that was how they communicated when no one was meant to hear. The missing chicken was not an attack. It was theft. Quiet. Efficient. The early lockups were not caution. They were routine. The extra lock was not a reaction. It was maintenance. I left without looking back. Weeks later, I read about an arrest in a nearby county. A man found living in woodland, linked to multiple farm thefts. He had been moving through rural properties for years, using barns and outbuildings for shelter, taking livestock to eat, avoiding contact. No violence reported. No explanation for the screams beyond what prolonged isolation and desperation can do to a person. I still think about that place when I hear the countryside described as peaceful. I think about how quiet can hide movement and how isolation cuts both ways. I wanted solitude. I got proximity instead. I missed the connection by 9 minutes. The platform clock said it clearly. I stood there with my bag at my feet and watched the tail of the train disappear into a curve of buildings and wires. It was late evening, already dark, and the air had that damp autumn smell that settles into stone and metal. I checked the departures board again, even though I knew nothing else was leaving until morning. I did the math in my head and realized I could either sleep on a bench or find somewhere cheap and close and leave early. I had been traveling for weeks on a small budget. I was in my early 20s and still thought inconvenience was part of the experience. I searched for places near the station because I did not want to cross an unfamiliar city at night. Most of the listings were either booked or more than I wanted to spend. One apartment stood out because it was cheap and less than 5 minutes on foot. The photos showed yellow walls, old furniture, and a narrow bed. Nothing about it looked comfortable, but it looked real. I booked it without thinking much further. The host messaged right away and said he would meet me in person to give me the key. That did not seem strange at the time. Many places worked that way. He told me to wait outside the building. I followed the map through streets that felt half empty, with closed shops and graffiti on metal shutters. I could hear trains even when I could not see them. The sound echoed between buildings and made the area feel restless. The building was a tall concrete block stained dark near the ground. The entrance smelled like old water and cigarette smoke. The lights inside flickered. I stood near the door and checked my phone again. After a few minutes, a man came down the street and slowed when he saw me. He was older than I expected, maybe late 40s or early 50s. He wore a jacket that looked too thin for the weather and carried keys on a long metal ring. He unlocked the door and waved me inside. The stairwell was narrow and the walls were chipped. We climbed to the second floor. My bag brushed the railing because the steps were uneven. He opened the apartment door and stepped aside. The inside smelled of cleaning chemicals layered over something older and harder to place. The lights were already on. The place matched the photos. Bare bulbs, a small table, a couch with worn fabric, a kitchenette with dishes stacked to dry. He handed me the key and did not leave right away. He stood close to the door and looked around as if checking something. He asked where I was headed next. I told myself it was normal curiosity and answered in general terms. He asked if I was meeting anyone in the city. I said no. He asked if anyone knew where I was staying. The question landed wrong. I felt it in my stomach before I understood why. I said that I was just passing through and would leave early. He nodded slowly and explained where the bathroom light switch was, even though it was obvious. He pointed out the window and mentioned the trains, saying they ran all night. He smiled while saying it, but his eyes stayed flat. When he finally stepped out, he lingered in the doorway and looked at me for a moment too long. I locked the door behind him and leaned my back against it, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. I dropped my bag on the floor and sat on the bed. The mattress sagged in the middle. I checked the lock again, and then the window. The window faced the tracks. I could see them clearly under yellow lights. Trains passed every few minutes. Some were loud and fast. Others crawled along and rattled. The sound vibrated through the glass and into the room. I told myself it would make sleep harder, but nothing else. I ate a snack and washed my face in the small sink. The mirror was cracked at one corner. I noticed how quiet the apartment felt between trains. The silence did not last long enough to feel peaceful. It felt more like holding breath. I lay down with my clothes still on and set my alarm for early morning. I checked the timetable on my phone one more time. The next train I needed left just after sunrise. As the night went on, the pattern of the trains began to feel wrong. They came too often. Sometimes two passed close together, then none for longer than expected. I compared the sounds to the schedule and realized they did not line up. I could hear engines when no train was listed. I could hear brakes when nothing should have been stopping. I told myself schedules change and freight trains run differently. Still, the mismatch kept me awake. Sometime after midnight, I noticed footsteps in the hallway. At first I thought it was another guest. The building had other apartments. The steps were slow and deliberate. They moved from one end of the hall toward my door. They stopped directly outside. I held still and waited. After a few seconds, the steps moved away. I listened until I could not hear them anymore. The next time it happened, I checked the time. It was just after 1. The same pattern repeated. Steps approaching. Pause at my door. Steps leaving. I tried to control my breathing. I told myself it could be someone going to the bathroom or smoking near the window at the end of the hall. Still, the way the steps stopped exactly in front of my door felt specific. Between these moments, trains continued to pass. Their lights flashed through the curtains. The room shifted between brightness and shadow. I did not turn off the lamp. I lay on my side and watched the door. Around 3, the footsteps came again. This time they stayed longer. I could hear weight shifting just outside. A train passed and covered the sound for a moment. When it cleared, the hallway was quiet again. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. I realized no one knew exactly where I was. I sat up and quietly gathered my things. I did not turn on more lights. I moved slowly, trying not to make noise. My bag felt louder than usual. The zipper seemed too sharp. I stopped when I heard another train and waited until it passed before continuing. At 4 in the morning, the handle turned. It moved just enough to tell me someone was testing it. Slowly, carefully, not a mistake, not a drunk person. The lock held. I did not move. My body felt heavy and hot. I stared at the door and counted my breaths. The handle did not turn again. After a long minute, footsteps moved away. I did not sleep after that. I sat on the bed with my bag on my lap. I watched the clock on my phone tick forward. When the sky outside began to lighten, I stood up. I unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. It was empty. The light buzzed overhead. I walked down the stairs and out into the street. I did not lock the door behind me. I did not look back. I walked straight to the station and waited inside until my train arrived. When it pulled in on schedule, the sound matched the board for the first time that night. I got on and sat by the window. As the city slid away, I replayed every moment in order. The meeting, the questions, the footsteps, the handle. None of it required imagination to explain. Someone knew I was alone. Someone checked. The lock worked. That was the only reason nothing else happened. It was a long weekend in May 2022 when 3 of us decided to drive into the Appalachian region for a few days away. The plan was simple: a cabin, no distractions, just the 3 of us, a single car, and the mountains. The listing made it clear there was no cell service. At first, that seemed like part of the appeal. We wanted a break from everything, from work emails and social media, from the constant pull of notifications. When we arrived, our phones showed signal bars, and that gave us a false sense of reassurance. We didn't realize that the bars were meaningless. Calls wouldn't go through, texts never sent. The cabin itself was tucked back along a narrow dirt road, surrounded by tall, uneven pine and oak. There was a small creek nearby, and a faint smell of damp leaves and earth hung in the air. The porch sagged slightly under our weight as we unloaded our bags. Everything inside was wooden and bare, roughly finished but functional. The furniture was old but sturdy. It had a small kitchen, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a wood stove. There were 3 beds, all neatly made with heavy quilts. A dusty shelf held a stack of mismatched books and an old radio. The windows had thick curtains that looked like they hadn't been washed in a while. It wasn't luxurious, but it was exactly the isolation we were looking for. The first night was quiet in the way mountains at dusk are quiet. Birds had gone silent, the creek murmured faintly, and the air cooled as the sun slipped behind the ridges. Around 11, I went to check my phone. Nothing. I tried dialing out. Nothing. My friends tried too. We realized then that signal bars meant nothing. For a moment, it was frustrating, then it felt freeing. No one could reach us, and we couldn't reach anyone. The radio sat on the small counter by the stove. It had a tuning knob that clicked with effort, the kind you could feel under your fingers. That first night it stayed off, but on the second night, I woke up to static. It was low, barely audible at first, and I assumed one of my friends had turned it on while half asleep. I got out of bed to turn it off. The static was high-pitched, buzzing against my eardrums. When I leaned close, I thought I heard faint voices under the white noise. I froze. They weren't distinct, just syllables or murmurs layered over the static. I shook my head and switched it off. The next day, we tried to make the most of it. We walked along the creek, explored the slope behind the cabin, and collected firewood. The forest was dense, the air damp and sharp with the smell of pine resin. The floor of the woods was littered with sticks and cones. and the occasional bird call was distant, almost swallowed by the trees. We laughed about the radio, joked about someone sneaking into the cabin. It didn't feel threatening, just odd. By evening, though, the radio had turned itself back on while we were cooking. Static again. My friend leaned close and whispered that he heard his name. I didn't respond. I didn't want to. Night came early. We lit the stove, made coffee for warmth, and tried to ignore the feeling that the cabin had grown smaller somehow. Around midnight, I was lying awake and noticed the curtains shifting. The air was still. There were no breezes. I told myself it was the weight of the fabric or the old windows settling. Still, the sense of being watched was there. It was the third night when the knocking started. I woke to the sound around 3:17 a.m. hard, deliberate. Not soft or hesitant. I could hear it through the walls and the thin wooden door. My friends were awake too, silent and tense. None of us moved to open it. The knocking came in sets, then paused, then returned. It lasted for nearly 5 minutes before stopping completely. Morning light spilled through the windows. The air smelled damp, colder than it should have been. That's when we noticed the handprints on the glass. Too high for any of us, large, smeared, as if someone had pressed against the door, tested it. They weren't small or tentative. They suggested weight, effort. My stomach turned. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, no road nearby, no other houses within a mile, maybe more. How had anyone reached the door without us noticing in the dark? We searched the perimeter. Nothing. No footprints in the wet soil, no tire tracks, no disturbed foliage. We packed quickly, moved without speaking much. The drive out was quiet. The road twisted, gravel crunching under the tires. We kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting someone to appear at the edge of the tree line. Nothing. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but the tension stayed with me for days. Every time I looked at my phone, I remembered the useless signal bars and the helplessness of being cut off completely. I checked the listing later. It's still active. The photos are the same, small, rustic, the same dirt road leading into the trees. The reviews stopped abruptly last year. People who stayed there gave short, neutral accounts, no long stories. My friends and I never went back, never talked about it much afterward. I still think about it sometimes. The handprints, the knocking, the voices under the static. I can't explain it. Everything was tangible, real. The cabin, the forest, the radio, the knocking. But there was no logical explanation for someone being there or how they moved around unseen. The worst part was the isolation. Phones that didn't work, a single car in the parking area, the mountain quiet. It's a memory that sits heavy, like the damp air in the cabin, and I can't shake it. We promised each other we wouldn't go back. We never have. The cabin remains out there, somewhere in those Appalachian hills, with its static radio, the handprints on the glass, and the untraceable footsteps. The reviews never mention anything sinister, never explain why people stop writing, but I know what's possible when no one else can hear, no one can reach you, and someone, or something, can be close enough to knock without being seen. I got the job through a local bulletin board in town. It was a small cash gig, the kind of work that didn't ask questions and didn't require a resume. The house was on the outskirts of a desert town in the southwest, isolated on a gravel road that cut through scrub and low mesquite. The sun baked the landscape during the day, and at night it turned sharp and cold. I had been told the work was simple. Clean the house between guest stays, vacuum, dust, scrub the bathroom, make the beds. The owner mentioned one rule specifically, not to touch the locked bedroom upstairs. He didn't explain why, only that it wasn't part of my job. Cash in hand, a firm handshake, and that was it. The first time I entered the house, I noticed the smell immediately. It wasn't rotten or anything you could identify easily. It was faint, metallic, and sharp, like iron mixed with dust. The air was dry, but it carried that subtle sting of something old. The place was furnished sparsely. Living room, kitchen, one bathroom, and a few bedrooms downstairs. The floorboards creaked under every step, and the windows rattled slightly when the wind blew. I started with the obvious chores, moving from room to room, making the beds and wiping down surfaces. The walls were painted a pale beige, but the paint had faded in uneven patches. It was on my second visit that I first noticed the sound. At first, I wasn't sure if it was real. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement upstairs. A slow, deliberate pacing, like someone walking back and forth across a room. There was also a cough, soft at first, then more pronounced. I froze for a moment, listening. It stopped as soon as I stopped moving, and I told myself it was my imagination. The owner had already warned me not to touch the upstairs room, and I had no reason to go up there. He had said the noise was just the pipes. That made sense in a way. Old houses settled, plumbing thumped, air conditioning vents rattled. I told myself that was all it was. I returned 2 more times that week. Each time, the pacing continued. The sound was irregular, but it was always there when I went upstairs to clean the hallways or the other rooms. I never looked directly into the locked room. The key hung on a hook by the front door. I had seen it only once, when the owner opened the door for a visitor, but it was always locked when I was there. Still, the sounds made me uneasy. There was a tension in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. By the 4th visit, I started paying attention to small details. The carpet in the hallway smelled faintly of something wet, and sometimes there were marks on the floor that didn't belong, scuffs or scratches, shallow and jagged, as if someone had dragged a heavy object along them. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my work. The house required a lot of effort to make presentable. Dust had accumulated in corners. The bathrooms had soap scum and mineral deposits. The kitchen counters were sticky. It was tedious work, but it was familiar. It was a late afternoon when I found the door open. I had been vacuuming the guest room at the end of the hall, near the staircase. I didn't go up there usually. I hadn't planned to. But when I walked past the top of the stairs, I saw it. The door, normally closed and firmly shut, was ajar. Something told me to stop, but I stepped forward. The room was empty. Bare walls, the window blinds drawn. There was a mattress on the floor, no frame, no sheets, nothing. But what caught my eye immediately were the scratches. They covered the walls at shoulder height, deep gouges that followed uneven lines across the plaster. They weren't random. Some curved, some jagged, but all of them suggested repeated motion. Whoever or whatever had made them had done so with force. The smell in the room was stronger here, metallic and coppery, almost suffocating. My stomach turned. I noticed the floorboards under the mattress were scuffed as well, and the edges of the room had marks that looked like someone had pressed against the walls or clawed at them. There were no personal items, no furniture, no signs of a guest. Nothing explained the pacing or the cough I had heard. The place felt heavy, like the air itself was thick with history I didn't want to know. I backed out slowly, feeling every step on the old wood. My hands were shaking, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I didn't close the door all the way. I left it as I had found it. I finished the rest of the cleaning mechanically, keeping my distance from the stairs. I checked every surface, every room, every corner, but the house seemed quieter than usual. Almost too quiet. I left that day with a sense of relief, but it was replaced by unease that settled deep in my chest. I couldn't explain why, only that I didn't want to be there. The next day, I returned for what I thought would be my last shift. I walked through the hallways carefully, trying not to think about the upstairs room. The sound of pacing came again, slower this time, but persistent. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. I kept cleaning, moving quickly but not rushing, trying to make everything look right. When I went back up to finish dusting the corners of the hallway, the door was closed again. I didn't look at it directly. I didn't want to. By the end of the shift, I decided I couldn't continue. The house was too strange. There was a weight in the air I couldn't shake, a presence I didn't want to define. I packed my supplies and left quietly. The owner was waiting outside when I walked to the car. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer another shift, didn't try to convince me to stay. I handed back the keys, accepted my cash, and left. Weeks later, I drove past the house on the way to a job in town. The lights were off, the windows dark. The front door remained closed. From the road, I couldn't see the upstairs window clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew what was in there, or at least I knew enough to never go back. I never saw anyone enter or leave through that door, and I never wanted to. I don't know what the scratches were from, or who, or what, made the pacing sounds. I didn't want to know. The house stayed on my mind for months, a quiet unease I carried with me whenever I thought about isolated places. I told a friend once, casually, that I had quit a cleaning job because the upstairs bedroom made me nervous. They laughed, assuming I was exaggerating. I didn't correct them. It wasn't a story to tell. It was a warning to myself, a memory of a place where I felt something I couldn't rationalize and didn't want to face. I haven't worked cleaning in isolated houses since. I stick to apartments or well-populated areas. The memory of that room, the scratches, and the pacing sound has stayed with me. I don't need to know the truth. I was only supposed to clean it, and I did. That was enough. Everything else wasn't mine to touch, and I'm glad I never did. The job was short, the money was cash, and I left quietly. It was the only way to leave, and it worked. I never returned, and I never planned to. The house remains there, somewhere in the desert, holding its secrets behind a locked door. I was only supposed to clean it, and I did exactly that. I booked the place because I was between leases and needed somewhere cheap for 2 weeks while I waited on a job start date. November had already stripped the fields bare, and western Pennsylvania looked like it was holding its breath for winter. The listing showed a converted farmhouse with wide shots taken in summer. White siding, trees full of leaves, sunlight coming through clean windows. The description promised quiet, isolation, and space to think. I was alone, carrying a laptop, a duffel bag of clothes, and a box of books. I wanted stillness and time to reset. The drive there took me off the highway and onto narrow roads that wound through low hills and abandoned farms. Cell service dropped 10 minutes before I arrived. The house sat back from the road behind a line of leafless maples. Gravel crunched under my tires as I pulled in. The host had left the door unlocked, as promised. A note sat on the kitchen counter with the Wi-Fi password written in neat block letters. It welcomed me and reminded me to lock up if I left the property. The house smelled like dust and cold iron. Old places have that scent when they have been closed for too long. The air felt dry and thin. Every sound traveled. My footsteps echoed through the rooms, even though the ceilings were low. The furniture was basic and worn. A couch with flattened cushions. A table with water rings baked into the surface. The kitchen had mismatched plates and a fridge that hummed louder than it should have. There were no personal photos, no decorations. It felt less like a home and more like a place paused between uses. The host lived next door, according to the listing, but I did not see any lights on in the nearby house. I assumed he worked nights or kept to himself. I unpacked, made a simple dinner, and set up my laptop at the table. The first night passed without trouble. I slept heavily, exhausted from the drive. The heating system woke me just after midnight. A deep thud rolled through the floor, followed by a low vibration. It sounded like something heavy being set down below me. The house did not have a basement, according to the listing, only a crawl space. The heat clicked on and off every hour. Each time came the same dull impact. I told myself it was old pipes shifting. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next 2 days settled into a routine. I woke late, worked on my laptop, cooked simple meals, and walked the surrounding property to kill time. The land sloped downward behind the house into woods thick with fallen leaves. There were no paths, only deer tracks and old fence posts leaning at odd angles. I did not see anyone else. No cars passed the road during the day. At night, the silence pressed in. The heating noise continued, but I adjusted to it. On the third afternoon, I was looking for extra paper towels when I noticed a narrow door behind the kitchen pantry shelves. It sat flush with the wall and had been painted the same off-white color. At first I thought it was a closet. When I pulled the pantry shelves aside, I saw there was no handle. Just a smooth surface and a deadbolt mounted on the other side of the door frame, facing inward. The bolt was locked. I stood there longer than I meant to. The door was old. The paint had cracked around the edges. It did not match the rest of the kitchen. I checked the listing on my phone and scrolled through every photo. There was no mention of an extra room or locked space. The house was described as fully accessible, single level, no stairs. That night the sound changed. The heating still came on, but between cycles I heard movement. It started as a faint creak, like weight shifting on old wood. Then it became steady. A pattern. The sound rose and fell, spaced evenly, like someone climbing stairs. The house did not have stairs. The floor beneath my bedroom was solid. I lay awake counting the seconds between each noise. The pattern repeated for nearly 10 minutes, then stopped. I did not sleep much after that. I kept the lights on until morning. When daylight came, the house looked ordinary again. The silence returned. I told myself stress was amplifying normal sounds. I made coffee and tried to work. By late afternoon, curiosity outweighed caution. I moved the pantry shelves again and knelt in front of the locked door. The deadbolt was heavy, industrial, not something meant for a closet. I pressed my ear to the wood. The air on the other side felt cooler. I smelled damp earth. I heard nothing. I messaged the host through the app and asked about the door. Hours passed without a reply. When the response came, it was brief and dismissive. That part of the house was not included. I was told not to worry about it. The message did not explain why it existed or what was behind it. That night I slept with my shoes on and my bag packed. The sounds began earlier than before. The steps were clearer now, slow and deliberate. They did not follow the heating cycle. They moved independently, stopping and starting without pattern. At one point the sound paused directly beneath the kitchen. The floor vibrated faintly, as if someone stood still and shifted their weight. I did not leave the bedroom. I watched the door handle, expecting it to move. It never did. Near dawn, the sound stopped. The house fell silent again. The next morning I drove into the nearest town for groceries and better reception. I searched public records on my phone while sitting in the parking lot of a gas station. The farmhouse address pulled up old property documents. The original structure had included a root cellar accessed from inside the house. In later years, it had been sealed after flooding issues. The records mentioned code violations related to unpermitted renovation work. No further details. When I returned, the front door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. The note on the counter was gone. Nothing else appeared disturbed. I checked every window. All were still latched. I stood in the kitchen listening. From behind the pantry wall came a faint scrape, like metal against stone. I did not confront the door. I loaded my car and left before dark. I contacted the platform and reported the stay. I drove to a motel near the highway and paid more than I wanted to, but I slept without noise for the first time in days. A week later, after I had started my job, I received a response from the platform. They had investigated the listing. The host had been renting out only part of the property. The locked area concealed access to the original cellar, which had been modified and was being used for storage and personal use. The host had been entering it through an exterior hatch at night to avoid disturbing guests, or so he claimed. The explanation fit the sounds. The steps. The weight. The timing. The host lived next door, but used the cellar beneath the rented space. The deadbolt faced inward to keep tenants out. The failure to disclose it violated policy. The listing was removed. I received a partial refund. What stayed with me was not the policy breach or the noise itself. It was the realization that someone had been moving beneath me while I slept, fully aware I was there, trusting the listing. The house was quiet again once I left, but the memory of that hidden space remains sharp. The sense of being observed from below, separated only by old wood and silence, is something I have not been able to forget.